It's the year 1997. The Sega Saturn is on the verge of being discontinued, Nintendo 64 sales have declined from its 1996 launch year, and Sony is dominating the North American home console market with its debut system, the PlayStation. Sony's meteoric success helped lure many longtime Nintendo collaborators into creating titles for the PlayStation brand. One of the companies that jumped ship was Square, creators of many of the most beloved JRPGs of all time. Square's freshman entry on the PlayStation? A little game known as Final Fantasy VII. Final Fantasy VII is iconic. It's been officially ported onto 7 different platforms, unofficially demade onto the NES, the opening was remade as a tech demo to show off the PlayStation 3's hardware capabilities, there's a full HD remake on the horizon, and it's still the #1 selling game in the Final Fantasy series, having sold over 13 million copies to date. Beyond that, there are numerous spin-off games, 2 different cuts of a sequel film, a short story collection, a novel, and even more thanks to the sub-series universe compilation of Final Fantasy VII. Personally, Final Fantasy VII is one of my favorite games of all time. But it's easy to take for granted how much of a phenomenon the game has become, to look through the lens of 2019 and say, of course Final Fantasy VII was a landmark video game. It wasn't always so clearly defined, and there were a lot of risks involved with Final Fantasy VII, both in-game and behind the scenes. Final Fantasy VII was only the 4th game in the series to see a North American localization, and only the 2nd Final Fantasy game released in Europe after Final Fantasy Mystic Quest. JRPGs were still a highly niche video game genre in the West, and 95% of Square's revenue prior to Final Fantasy VII came solely from Japan. Final Fantasy and Square brand recognition in the West was anywhere between low and non-existent. In the early 1990s, Nintendo had a close working relationship with many Japanese developers, including Square. Square had recently released Final Fantasy VI on the Super Famicom, which was localized as Final Fantasy III in North America, and Final Fantasy VI saw modest Western sales, amassing approximately 400,000 copies sold in its North American lifetime. Square had already started preliminary work on a Final Fantasy VI sequel for the Super Famicom, but soon shifted its focus over to Nintendo's upcoming system, then codenamed Ultra 64. In mid-1995, Square showed off a Final Fantasy tech demo for Ultra 64 named Final Fantasy VI The Interactive CG Game. But it soon became evident that Square's ambitious sequel would not work on Nintendo's new platform. Square director and producer Yoshinori Kitase recounts, "Anyway, we made a 2000 count polygon version of Behemoth for the Nintendo 64, but when we rendered and animated it, the frame rate was way too low. To properly display Behemoth with that technology, we needed 2000 polygons, but it was a little too much for the hardware. That was the problem with choosing Nintendo." It was around mid to late 1995 that Square was first approached by Sony about working with the PlayStation brand. Square began running benchmarks on both Nintendo 64 and PlayStation development kits, and it became patently obvious that the PlayStation would be the best choice for the next Final Fantasy title. Series creator Hironobu Sakaguchi and then Square president Tomoyuki Takechi both stated that the CD format was the main reason for the change, as CDs could hold more memory and were much more cost efficient than Nintendo cartridges. Despite Nintendo's best efforts to keep Square as a partner, Square announced in 1996 that it was departing from its decade-long working relationship with Nintendo to work instead on the Sony PlayStation. Nintendo was not pleased. Square Japan character programmer Hiroshi Kawai recalled that Nintendo told Square, "If you're leaving us, never come back," with Takechi adding, "It was pretty uncomfortable. There were about 4 to 5 years where we couldn't really talk with Nintendo. We didn't have a friendly relationship with them." The pressure was on. If Final Fantasy VII was a failure, it could have spelled the end for both Square and the PlayStation. Square went full steam into Final Fantasy VII's development and spared no expense trying to make the best game possible. The company reportedly spent between $20 to $40 million on graphics processing hardware and software alone, and the game's development team quickly jumped from 30 or so team members up to 150 or more. These new hires were among the best and brightest in the gaming industry, who all wanted a chance to work on the cutting edge thanks to the new hardware and software. Not wanting to be outdone, longtime series veterans also stepped up. Tetsuya Nomura was an integral part of Final Fantasy VII's development, doing everything from character design to being the source behind the game's biggest plot twist. Series composer Nobuo Uematsu was no longer restricted by weaker system hardware and challenged himself to create music that was atypical of video game soundtracks. And the core staff of Final Fantasy VII, namely Hironobu Sakaguchi, Yoshinori Kitase, Tetsuya Nomura, and Kazushige Nojima, among others, set out to write a story that was profound, touching, and unlike any role-playing game seen thus far. Meanwhile, Square signed a 6-game Western publishing deal with Sony. This gave Sony the Western publishing rights to Final Fantasy VII in exchange for Square getting lucrative royalties and assistance with its Western ad campaigns. According to Takechi, they were really eager to publish it under their brand, and because they were so eager, they also signed a deal with very good conditions, where Square earned almost as much money as if we had published it ourselves. Sony spent $100 million on a 3-month-long advertising campaign for the PlayStation brand, with Final Fantasy VII as the face of the campaign. Sony's campaign saw Final Fantasy VII promoted in everything from TV commercials during World Championship Wrestling Nitro and The Simpsons, to print ads in DC and Marvel comic books. There was even a holiday promotional tie-in with Pepsi. Square also spent a lot of money on advertising, totaling approximately $40 million, with $20 million spent exclusively on the US. The old Square publishing studio in Seattle was shuttered and a new publishing office was opened in Los Angeles. Jun Iwasaki was hired as the vice president of marketing for Square USA and recalled that Sakaguchi told him, "Your mission is to sell 1 million copies of Final Fantasy VII." Sony worked closely with Square and Square USA, treating Final Fantasy VII as a first-party title to ensure its success. Yet despite all this, there was still doubt about Final Fantasy VII's success overseas. Takechi had spoken confidently about the game's Japanese release, and rightfully so. Within 3 days of hitting Japanese store shelves, Final Fantasy VII had already sold 2 million copies. But NTSC and PAL regions were a different story. Japanese role-playing games had never sold particularly well outside of Japan, and Final Fantasy was no different. Tensions were high, rumors of job cuts and studio closure were floating around. Square was regularly checking in on Sony to approve ad campaigns. There were constant struggles regarding things like pre-order numbers, how best to describe the gameplay during press events, and why the term RPG should be avoided. And then, in a flash, it was release day. And the world of video games was changed forever. Final Fantasy VII was officially released in North America on the 7th of September 1997, and in Europe on the 17th of November 1997. Many retailers had already broken street date and started selling their copies of the game early, and within a few days, Final Fantasy VII had already sold over 300,000 copies, more than 75% of the lifetime sales of Final Fantasy VI. And the milestones kept coming. 500,000 copies sold within 3 weeks, 1 million copies sold by December. And everybody loved it. Sure, the game had and has its faults. The initial translation was poor, some character depictions were more stereotypes than personalities, and by today's standards, the graphics are beyond blocky and cartoonish. But many have called Final Fantasy VII incredible, a masterpiece, the greatest game ever made, and many still laud the game to this day, as Final Fantasy VII frequently appears on and or tops any given greatest games of all time list. So what makes Final Fantasy VII special? There's definitely a lot great about it. The gameplay is faster and more chaotic, the limit break system changed the landscape of JRPG gameplay, and the materia system is still arguably the best magic system in the Final Fantasy series. The music is both beautiful and iconic, as the most famous melodies remain with you long after you've beaten the game, and many of the touring Final Fantasy concerts are punctuated by the music of Final Fantasy VII. But personally, I think it's the characters. The cast of characters all have unique backstories that give them a lot of emotional depth, individual relationships are constantly evolving in time with the plot, and you see the organic progression of characters through their personal story arcs. We are all the heroes of our own stories, and through that lens you can understand the struggles not just in your party members, but in the game's antagonists as well. And the story tackles difficult and mature themes, addressing everything from issues with self-identity, to depression, to the loss of loved ones, which resonated with members of Final Fantasy VII's audience, many of whom have never played a Final Fantasy game until 7. Whatever the reason, Final Fantasy VII's impact is undeniable. Final Fantasy VII made JRPGs a popular genre in the West, giving gamers around the world a chance to play not only more Final Fantasy games, but beloved JRPG series like Dragon Quest, Persona, Tales, and The Legend of Heroes. Many members of Final Fantasy VII's development team have also gone on to do their own things, from creating new video game IPs like Lost Odyssey and Blue Dragon, to crafting scores for games such as Grand Blue Fantasy and The Lost Story. Even Final Fantasy VII's development and promotional cycle has been re-implemented to the same degree of success. The Infamous series and the PlayStation 4 exclusive Spider-Man game were both developed by third-party companies, with Sucker Punch being behind Infamous and Insomniac Games developing Spider-Man. But both the Infamous series and Spider-Man were treated as first-party titles, much like Final Fantasy VII, and Sony sank large amounts of money into advertising both during their respective runs, leading to incredible success for both Infamous and Spider-Man, just like what happened with Final Fantasy VII. Perhaps most importantly of all, Final Fantasy VII has been called the game that sold the PlayStation. Final Fantasy VII's direct impact on PlayStation sales not only opened the door for other PlayStation JRPGs like Wild Arms and Suikoden, but also created a wider potential audience for other PS1 games that would go on to become hugely successful series like Metal Gear Solid. And with so many people adopting the PlayStation 1, Sony became a household name in home consoles, eventually leading to even greater success with the PlayStation 2, which many will argue is the greatest home console of all time. And at the end of the day, Final Fantasy VII is still a deep, engaging, and fantastic game, if only one that's rough around the edges. I think that's why I love it so much, and maybe that's why so many others do too. Personally, I can't wait to play the remake and fall in love with Final Fantasy VII all over again. Thank you so much for watching. This video was really difficult but a lot of fun to make. I did a lot of reading and researching, and if you want to read my sources for yourself, please check the video description. Don't forget to subscribe, click the bell icon, and check out my other videos on screen. I'm super proud of all of them, which are my Legend of Heroes Trails of Cold Steel and PS4 review, my Dragon Quest XI review, and my Kingdom Hearts 3 review. No spoilers in any of those, so feel free to check them out even if you're in the midst of those games. And if you like this video, please share it with your friends. Thanks.